Thank you very much for everyone for coming to listen to me. Yeah, I'll be giving this kind of long lecture tomorrow. So I'm not going to repeat myself, but basically what I'll be arguing tomorrow is that over the last couple of, 2-3 decades, we have seen a lot of arguments saying that Ghana and other African economies are destined to underdevelop for structural reasons that cannot be changed. So they have the wrong culture, the people don't work hard, they don't value education, you've heard it. They don't cooperate with each other, they don't save, There are other arguments based on climate. Tropical climate is supposed to create disease, give you poor quality soil. A lot of African countries are landlocked. I mean, it doesn't apply to Ghana, but when you are landlocked, you cannot trade with the outside world. Any number of reasons. And I think that many of these are just bogus. Some have some validity, but their importance is exaggerated. So let's take some of the bogus argument. This argument that Ghana or whatever African country has the wrong culture and that's why they are not developing. This is exactly what the English said about the Germans in the early 19th century. This is exactly what the Americans said about the Japanese in the early 20th century. This is exactly what the Japanese said about the Koreans when they colonized Korea. The most shocking statements, I'll give you one or two examples tomorrow, but are made by English people visiting Germany in the sort of early to mid 19th century when Germany was still a poor country. They would say everything. They would say Germans are incapable of rational thinking. They are too individualistic. They are too emotional. Almost the antithesis of the stereotype German, the stereotype of Germans that the English people have today. They said that Germans do not have a sense of time. They have no sense of future. They are dishonest. So basically, culture is something that doesn't change overnight, but changes in the long term. And there are many reasons, but one of the most important reasons why culture changes is economic development. So one trait that is typically mentioned as trait of the poor countries is timekeeping, poor sense of timekeeping. I'm told that you also have the expression the Ghanaian time, but until 20 years ago, 25 years ago, we had that in Korea. We had this expression called Korean time, which means that you can be late for appointment for, I don't know, up to 1.5 hours and don't have to apologize. Why do people behave like that? Because when you are living in an agrarian society, work in your field, you had a bit too much to drink last night, you got up 40 minutes late, okay, you go to your field 40 minutes later, and you come back 40 minutes later, no big deal. But if you're working in a factory, on a production line, everyone has to be there at 8:45 so that the production line can start. So industrial society demands timekeeping. And with economic development, time becomes more valuable because the material goods you have become more and more, but time is fixed, only 24 hours in a day. So people begin to value time more. So today in Korea, I guarantee you, when Ghana reaches, say, $10,000 per capita income, the expression Ghanaian time will begin to disappear. Anyway, so there are these bogus arguments like cultural arguments. There are some of these structural arguments that make sense, like being landlocked is not good for international trade. However, did you realize that Ethiopia has grown much faster after it became landlocked? There's a civil war, Eritrea secedes, Ethiopia becomes landlocked. Exactly from that point, Ethiopia begins to have its super growth. In the last 15 years, actually, it has grown faster than China. So, yes, it is a barrier, but I mean, it's not an insurmountable barrier, because Ethiopia basically does a deal with Djibouti and exports everything from there. It can be overcome. Well, also, just think about it. Two of the richest economies in the world, in Europe, are landlocked: Switzerland and Austria. So yes, once again, I mean, I'm not saying that things like being landlocked is completely irrelevant, but these are not the reason. The reason is that some countries have used the right policies and and others haven't. And when you put it this way, a lot of people say, oh yeah, of course, that you need to use free trade, free market policies recommended by the World Bank and the IMF and all the visiting academics from American and European universities. But are these really the policies that have made countries like South Korea, and before that Japan, before that Germany, before that the United States and Britain rich? No. As I'll tell you in some detail tomorrow, these countries all use protectionism, government subsidies, state-owned enterprises, many government regulations to basically the most dramatic examples come from my native South Korea and Japan, but you go back in history, you have examples from Germany, Britain, I'm not going to recommending today. So it's to climb to the top and kicking the ladder away so that other people can follow. I mean, the expression doesn't actually come from myself. It comes from the 19th century German economist called Friedrich List. Anyway, so I'm showing that these free trade, free market policies that, well, Ghana had this filled with during the days of structural adjustment program are not the policies that have promoted development in today's rich countries. But then this doesn't mean that I'm advocating going back to the days of Nkrumah. Because there are some things that those policies got wrong. So for one thing, you neglected export. You need to have good export capability in order to develop. Why? Because by definition, as a developing country, you need to import technologies to be able to develop. The reason why you are poor is because your technology sucks. And you need to get better technologies in the forms of machines, technology licensing, whatever. And in order to do that, you need foreign exchanges. Foreign aid can cover some of it, but basically you have to earn this money. Unfortunately, in the 60s, many countries that pursued what then was known as import substitution industrialization, neglected export, and got into balance of payment problems. Sometimes they couldn't run factories because they couldn't import the spare parts. So the promoting export is very important. However, this does not, as the World Bank, the IMF people will suggest to you, mean having a free trade policy. Because in order to continue good export performance, you need to keep growing new industries. So you might start with some cheap labor industry, And then as soon as you become successful and your economy begins to grow, wages are rising. What are you going to do? You need new industries to replace them. Industries that use higher technologies, that have higher productivities. Already in some parts of China, for example, wages are higher than in Mexico. So if China just kept exporting textile, the economy will be dead. It hasn't, because China has already, in the same way that Korea did, Japan did before it, China has already moved into shipbuilding, mobile phones. I bet many of you have Huawei phones. It's eating into the market shares of Apple and Samsung. Korean shipbuilding industry is in big trouble because of Chinese competition and so on. So, you need to keep growing these new industries, which require certain degree of government protection and nurturing. So actually, you need to have infant industry protection, even just to have successful export performance. Another thing that was the problem with the old strategy in Ghana was the neglect of agriculture. I mean, of course, by definition, in the beginning, you have to suck the resource and the people from agriculture in order to industrialize. Because where else are you going to get those things? Because your economy is agrarian. But after a while, you need to give it back. You need to invest in irrigation and other rural infrastructure, invest in the agricultural research, provide extension services, subsidize fertilizer and whatnot, because otherwise we'll have the food crisis. You will, as a result, have to import a lot of food, leading to balance of payment problems. If you have a strong agricultural sector, it can also provide markets for your new industries. So, you need to get this balance right. Unfortunately, in the old days, this was neglected. So, I mean, I have a few more things to say in this regard, but so I am not advocating, going back to the Nkrumah, but let's not forget that during those so-called bad old days of import substitution, Ghana and most other African countries did much better than during the structural adjustment period, when per capita income in many African countries is actually falling, not rising. For sub-Saharan Africa as a whole, per capita income is barely back to where it was in 1980. So those are not the policies that we need to look at. It's the other policies. Of course, you cannot exactly copy what Korea did in the 1970s or the US did in the 19th century. But my view is that the economic experiments are very dangerous and costly. I mean, you've been subject of experiment by the World Bank with the structural adjustment program. So why not go back to history, learn lessons from other countries? Of course, you have to modify this to suit your conditions. But I think that kind of looking at the history and, I mean, contemporary experiences of other countries, I think that can save you a lot of the aggravation. I mean, for example, if you, I mean, of course, there's a limit to that strategy. But if you want to generate growth through agricultural processing, there's the example of Chile to look at. They have been extremely successful with it. If you want to develop, well, not that you necessarily should. I mean, if you want to develop shipbuilding industry, go to China and Korea to learn how they have done it. So, to conclude, I don't believe in some foreigner coming for 2 days and telling people what to do. But I'm here to provoke you to think about these things in a more open-minded way, because for far too long, developing countries, including Ghana, have been brainwashed into believing that there's only one way to do it. No. I mean, even among the rich capitalist countries, the free market model is minority. It's used mainly by the US and the UK and a couple of Eastern European countries. Other countries have all different models. Japanese capitalism, Swedish capitalism, French capitalism. There isn't just one way, and there are many different ways. And I'm not saying that you should follow the Korean model or the French model or whatever, but you need to think about this in a more open-minded way. And I hope my presence in this country becomes a catalyst for that more broad-minded conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chang, for those insightful opening remarks. May we now take a few questions? And you could please indicate by raising up your hand to show that you'd want to come into questions. Yes.
My name is Godfrey and I'm with TV3. My question is, looking at Ghana's current state, do you think that Ghana should go the protectionism way or be liberal, looking at our economic condition and all that? And also, with the Ghana thinking of a 40-year development goal, plan. Do you think that that is the way to go? And if it is not, what do you think exactly should be done? Thank you.
Right. Yeah. On the first question, I think actually it's problematic to exactly split protectionism and free trade, because no country that pursues pure protectionism except for North Korea, and no country pursues complete free trade. Do you think that the US has free trade? No. I mean, in sectors that matter, they have huge protection. I mean, on average, they have low protection, but for certain segments of textile, the tariff rate could be 15%. So I think basically what you have to, how you have to approach this is to think, I mean, what industries you want to promote in the next 5-10 years, and what kind of policies you need to do that. Sometimes the conclusion might be yes, that we need tariff. Sometimes the conclusion might be no, we don't need tariff, but we need support with the worker training or research and development. So you have to approach it on a case-by-case basis. I don't think this uniform policy, whether it's towards the protectionist direction or the free trade direction, uniform policy, I don't think that works. And the second point is, 40-year plan. I mean, 40 years. I don't know whether in 40 years' time the human race will exist, given climate change. So, I mean, probably 40 years is far too much into the future, but you need some kind of long-term sense of direction, because the country needs to create some kind of consensus on where we are going. Yeah, so that you could say, well, we will industrialize, but what industry? I mean, are you going to promote, I don't know, automobile and machine tools industries, or are you going to promote biotechnology, pharmaceutical, the petrochemical, different industries require different policies, different human skills, different financing arrangements. So the country needs to have some sense of direction. Of course, if you have a very long-term plan like 40 years, you'll have to revise it at least every 10 years. But having that some broad sense of direction, I think is going to be helpful in focusing people's mind and allowing people to coordinate activities better.
My name is Sixtus. I work with CTF. It's interesting you started with the concept of time. Hello? My name is Sixtus. I work with CTFM. It's interesting you started with the concept of time. You mentioned the Korean people had the same problem that the Ghanaian people are experiencing today. But you also said that the Korean people were able to overcome that problem, and today it's better. My question is, how did the Korean people overcome that? Was that engineered by a private sector initiative or something that was started from within government itself? Because these days in Ghana, even the programs that are to be, you expect government functionaries to attend, they come very late, and the program starts very late. I believe this one also started very late, in accordance with the advertised time that I received. So how was the problem handled in Korea? My second question, infant industries, you talked about the protection for them, helping them perform as much as they should. There's a policy in Ghana that allows some amount of protection for local industries in some job areas. Foreign entities are not allowed to get into some market space in Ghana. How would you evaluate this particular policy? Put together by CTFM said that was not what they wanted. How would you evaluate that particular policy? And should we be looking at a different approach to helping infant industries? And finally, you said you were not advocating that Ghana goes back to the days of Kwame Nkrumah. And you said this right after you had said protectionism is not necessarily the way to go. So really, what are you advocating for Ghana?
Right. On the first one, my point was actually, government did some campaign, but in the end, the changes in timekeeping came because the way people live changed. Because government can say all they want, but unless people themselves think time is valuable, unless they work in a job that requires timekeeping, they are not going to keep time. So it's more about developing the economy, and as a consequence, people themselves are beginning to behave in different ways, not about government telling people what to do. It doesn't work at that level. For record, this event, as far as I know, was supposed to start at 3:30, so I think we did quite well with timekeeping, but maybe you haven't told this 3, so maybe there was miscommunication. On the second one, the government having a dialogue with the private sector and trying to figure out what they actually want. Because you are saying that they are getting some tariff protection, but that relevant businessmen think that's not what is needed. So actually, you need the communication between the government and the private sector in order to figure out exactly what is needed. And that leads me to the third point. I said not necessarily protectionism because sometimes protection from foreign imports is the most important policy to use, but some other times that's not really the most important policy. It could be lack of skilled workers. It could be that as far as we have skilled workers, we don't actually need protection because we can achieve competitive level of productivity. So in that case, why should you waste resource and time providing tariff protection is not going to solve the problem. So what I'm saying is that not necessarily that protection is good or bad, but what the industries need in order to grow and become competitive differ across industries, across countries. So sometimes it will be tariff protection, sometimes it will be particular financing arrangement, sometimes it will be particular types of skilled workers. You need to identify them before you implement those policies. So sometimes it's protectionism, sometimes it's not.
Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. I'm Michael and I'm a correspondent for What's on Africa in the UK. Please, as we speak, the Ghanaian government is making plans to roll out a policy to develop or build a factory in each of the districts of the country. What is the single best piece of advice you have for the Ghanaian government on how it should proceed about this policy? Thank you.
Well, I think, I don't know what the reason was behind this policy, but I think that policy is not as strange as it may sound. Because, factories are very particular institutions which the developing countries are not used to. It's a very regimented system, it's very organized. You just drop the farmers in the middle of the factory and try to kind of make them work there. It doesn't work. I mean, they need to get used to the way of doing things in a factory. So actually, having these factories in each area might actually expose people to how this place works and make them kind of realize that this is a different way of life, different way of making a living, different way of making things. So actually, in the 19th century, I mean, at the time, Germany was divided into many small states, and many of the German states actually set up model factories. So these were state-owned factories producing textile, porcelain, whatever, and they were there to demonstrate what they at the time called the industrial arts to people who are not used to it. So maybe it is not such a strange idea, although maybe I'm giving too charity, and maybe that will prompt some people to set up their own factories. Some of the workers who are working in these model factories might go out later and become their own entrepreneurs. Who knows?
Right. Thank you very much for your questions. And at this point, may I say a very big thank you to Dr. Chang for sharing some of his insights with us. And I believe that we're taking away quite a lot of thoughts to continue pondering over. Ladies and gentlemen of the press, thank you so much for your questions and also for making the time to join us here this afternoon. I'm sure you also have a lot to digest from this question and answer session, and we look forward to seeing you, most of you, tomorrow for the main address and the roundtable discussion. So thank you all once again.